Morning, Shweta. Good morning, bache. Can you be a bit louder?
Yes,
We're
ma'am,
not
sir.
able to hear you. Can you try being a bit louder, beta?
Yes, ma'am, sir.
Okay.
Greetings to everyone. Respected Professor Gurley, Principal of Kalinji College, Professor Moira, thank you so much, ma'am, for the blessing, support, and guidance. Without this webinar would be not have been possible. Teachers and fellow students, I, Shweta Singh, a student of BA program with history as major, along with Ms. Smiti, has been given the opportunity to host today's webinar. The theme of today's webinar is literature, text, and history. I request Ms. Smiti to continue with the welcome address.
Thank you, Shweta. Professor David has achieved various accolades and has done outstanding work in both his education and publishings. He has completed his master's and PhD from Department of History, University of Chicago. His topic for PhD was rulers and merchants in 18th century Bengal. He is fluent in Bengali and knows simple Sanskrit. His main publications to be issued in press are Literary and Religious Practices in Medieval and Early Modern India 2016. His book Poetry and History, Bengali Mongol Kabo and Social Change in Pre-Colonial Bengal 2008 has been recognized worldwide. He has written various articles, some of which are Battle and Self-Sacrifice in Bengali Warriors Epic, Lawson's Quest to be a Raja in Dharma Mongol in Ralph W. Nicholas, Rites of Spring, 2008, Fair Grain Markets and Mughal Famine Policy in 18th Century Bengal, Calcutta Historical Journal, 1977, and many more. His works are exemplary for students and learners like us. Without any further ado, I would like to invite our chief guest, Professor Curley, to enlighten us all with his words.
Can you hear me all? Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. And should I turn on the camera? Or will that affect the sound?
No, sir, it won't. You can.
Okay. Maybe I can't. There we are. Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me to this class. I thought it might be helpful for you to understand how accidentally I found myself reading Bengali Mongol Kabo in order to try to do history. I didn't start out to do that at all. I think it might be interesting for you to know that I didn't know I was going to be a historian until I was drafted into the US Army and served in Vietnam, not in combat, I hasten to say, but it was still a very difficult event for me to go through. And I came out of it thinking, I want to study some colonial experience in Asia, something about colonialism in Asia. So I at that point, I wasn't even thinking of India necessarily. And it was only when a professor at the University of Chicago told me, you are quite old to be beginning this. You're going to have to learn a language and 2 languages. If you choose the Dutch area, you'll have to learn Dutch plus Indonesian Bhasha. 2 or more if you choose Indochina, French plus, maybe 2 other languages. He said, but if you choose India, you can use your English and just learn an Indian language. And I said, that's the first practical advice I've ever got from the University of Chicago. So I came back the next day and I told him, yes, it's a good idea. I understand. He said, well, fine, good. We have to sign you up for a rapid class in an Indian language, a summer, year-long. Yes, you learn the first year just in the summer. And so which language do you want? And I said, I don't know. So he began going through the various languages, starting with Hindi, of course. And I interrupted him and said, well, I'd like this to be fun. Tell me which vernacular languages have the best literature. And I don't know how he made this decision, but he said, well, that would be Tamil, of course, and Bengali. And I said, well, which one is easier? He said, Bengali. So that's how I got to the study of Bengal. It was such an accident, you see. However, from that experience in Vietnam, I also knew that I could not understand the transition to colonial rule using only English documents. It didn't make any sense to even try to do that to me. I had understood how much I could not understand because I did not understand Vietnamese. And so I didn't want to repeat that kind of frustration. So I put all the effort I could into learning Bengali. And I thought, well, I'll find Bengali documents when I get to Calcutta, when I start doing my research. But of course, it's easier said than done to get to Bengali documents. You have to be known, you have to be trusted. Families have to invite you in and kind of test you out. And only after quite a bit of time and effort do they begin to share anything with you. So nobody shared anything with me that first trip. And I went back to write my dissertation without what I was hoping for, which was a Bengali counterpart to the English documents that I'd been able to see in London and Calcutta. Let me pause just here and make sure that I'm speaking in a way that is understandable. Am I going too fast? Is this okay?
It's fine, sir.
It's okay? All right. Yep. So I came back, I wrote the dissertation. Honestly, I thought it was a failure. My professor sent it out for one press to review, and I got a very critical review back. And I thought, I just didn't do what I wanted to do with this dissertation. And on top of that failure, I also didn't get an academic job. So there I was without a job, without any way to get from the United States to London or to India to re-enter archives or start more research. And I thought to myself, what am I going to do? But I already had read enough of Mongol Kabo to understand that I could be interested in them. And I already had some ideas about literature and how to read it from my education at the University of Chicago. And I already had brought back about 15 or 20 of the University of Calcutta editions of different Mongol Kabo. So I had something on my shelves, all sort of rebound in leather to preserve them in Calcutta, and there they were sitting there. And I thought, well, maybe I could do that. Maybe that would be a way to get a Bengali source about pre-colonial Bengal, at least. And that's where I started, honestly. I knew that I was interested in middlemen of various kinds, merchants, bankers, accountants, managers, dawans, people who passed between the European and the Bengali worlds, all up and down the Hooghly River and beyond. But I had no access to any original documents about such people. And so I kind of changed my subject and pushed it back in time to match the time of the Mongol Kabo that I was starting to read. And I just thought I'll read the best one, the most fun one that I can find. And someone said, Joni Mongol, do it, Mukunda. Mukunda's Joni Mongol. And so that's where I started. So my question really is, how do we bring literature and history together? How do we begin to make them close enough to each other that we can use them back and forth? I knew I did not just want to read Mongol Kabo to pick out little bits of this fact and that fact that happened to be recorded. I didn't want to do that because I didn't think you could trust the facts taken from literature as facts. I thought they would have to be supported by other kinds of documents. And so what would I learn from literature that would really be specific to literature? How would it really help me, not just by confirming what I might already know through some other source, but how would it help me see something that I couldn't otherwise see? So that was really my question. And the answer is, I think, that you have to begin with the distinction between history as objective. I don't mean by that, I don't mean unbiased. I mean history as dealing with the world, and history as subjective. And by that, I don't mean it depends on, whatever each person sees, it's different. I mean history as being about people's thoughts and feelings and assumptions and unconscious assumptions about the world that they live in. And I thought that literature would be more revealing about the second, subjective history, than it would be about objective history. I think that's not an absolute rule. I found interesting facts in reading Mongol Kabo, and I don't mean to criticize people who take that approach at all. But my approach was to read history in order to get a kind of a better understanding of human thoughts and feelings and assumptions and unconscious patterns than it was to read about the objective nature of the world. How do we do that then? How do we try to find, how does literature tell us something about that? And my sense of the answer to that question was that it would depend on what the purpose of an individual piece of literature, a particular text, was. That you'd have to find a way of reading the text that aligned with the purpose for which that text was written and read. How do you find the purpose of a text? Well, I learned something about that at the University of Chicago from Aristotle, who said, you find out about the purpose of something like literature by trying to understand its form. And by its form, we mean essentially its genre. So we look at a text, we try to see, okay, how is this made? How is this arranged? What might be the purposes of an arrangement like this? What's the author trying to get to have happen if he writes the text in this particular way? And it's different. It's just different for texts that are supposed to be melodramas, like many of the Gitika, or texts that are supposed to teach us something, like the Puranas and much of the Mongol Kabo literature, or a text that let's see, what would be a good example? A text that doesn't have a single purpose, that kind of wanders through a series of purposes, if you can imagine that, but doesn't ever settle on one particular overall purpose, in which case you just have to read it kind of fluidly to see what each part of it is trying to do. So I began looking at Mongol Kabo with that idea in mind, trying to figure out why it was written. And it seemed to me obvious from the first that it was not written to be a comedy or a tragedy. It was not overall a melodrama, keeping us in suspense and then giving us a happy ending at the end. It was instead meant to teach. That is its purpose. It's meant to teach. And texts that are meant to teach all over the world, not just in English, not just in Bengali, often have the same kind of structure. They'll tell us one story, and then if we haven't got the point through that story, they'll tell us another story, starting from the beginning, a completely different story. But when we come to the end, we realize, oh yes, that's the same point. They're trying to get this across, but with a different story. And then they might even tell us a third story, still with the same basic purpose. And those stories might be linked all together. They might be set into parentheses. So it's a story within the story, within the story. Or they might be linked. One leads to the next one, leads to the next one. Or they might be just completely separate. But whichever it is, they're present in the text because the author is trying to teach us something important. And so I began to read Mongol Kabo for what it was trying to teach us. And I discovered, I think, two things. One is that a lot of people didn't read it that way. They would read the story of Kalketu, the hunter in Choni Mongol, and think it was completely separate from the story of Dhanapati and his wives in the second half, and criticize it for not being an integrated single work of literature, without understanding that these two are really teaching the same kind of lesson. And so I began to look for, okay, what might be a common lesson? What might hold this text together, its different stories together? And that's been the fundamental approach that I've taken to reading literature. So I would encourage you to use this when you look at something new, a work of vernacular literature that you're not familiar with. Ask yourself, what is it trying to do? What's its purpose? And to figure out its purpose, you'll have to figure out something about how it's shaped. What choices did the author make? Why did she or he put this first and then that? Or why did she set up this expectation and then confound us by having it turn out to be false? Try to read it as something that is a made thing with a certain set of purposes in mind. Okay? So I think that's how I've started out, and when I've turned to other kinds of literature, I've asked myself the same question. What genre does this belong to? What's it trying to do? Is it more an entertainment or is it more an instruction? If it's an entertainment, what kind of entertainment is it? How are we meant to feel about it? What sequence of feelings do we go through as we read it? And that kind of question, I think, helps us to see how it might give us a better understanding of subjective history, not facts about the world, but facts about people's minds. Let me pause there and see how we're doing for time. So I'm about halfway through, it looks like. Let me go on then to history and to the kinds of history I was trying to write, and how Mangal Kabo affected my understanding of history. You'll note from my book's title that I was interested in social history. I didn't have a clear idea of what social history is. I hesitate to confess this to you, but it's the truth. I was noticing, though, something about Mangal Kabo that fit with the training that I had received, not from historians, but from anthropologists. I was noticing that it was about kin groups and kin relationships. It was about little kingdoms and the different offices in a kingdom. It was about merchants and markets and journeys and successes and failures in the journey. It seemed like a kind of anthropology. Now, I know Mangal Kabo have always been described as religious texts. And I don't disagree, they certainly are. They're meant to teach us why and how we should worship a particular deity. But you could have a much simpler text do that job. And much simpler texts do. Vratas, for example, Vratas do. In a few pages, what Mangal Kabo do in many, many, many pages. What makes it necessary for the Mangal Kabo to be so complicated? And the answer seemed to me was that religion is not just religion. People didn't think in European Enlightenment terms that separate out economies from politics and politics from the realm that's outside of politics in social life, and then all of that is something secular, separated from what is religion. It's just not how people thought. Religion had to do with ordinary life, all the aspects of ordinary life. And so the Mangal Kabo were complicated because they told at the same time a story about learning to worship the deity and a story about resolving some real world problem that was shared between the world of the text as it's written and the world of the author, and especially his audience, as they heard the text being performed, so that they could see what was happening and apply it in one way or another to their own lives, and think about how what lesson the Mongol Kabo was teaching, not just about religion, but about human life. I still think that's largely true. However, I think I missed something really important about the religious dimension of Mongol Kabo. All of them lead to a kind of puja. And I never stopped to ask myself, what is a puja and how is the instruction about ordinary life in a Mongol Kabo related to the ritual task of a puja and the expectation that it delivers not just otherworldly rewards, but this worldly rewards? That's a question I wish I had taken more seriously. I have to say, with my decisions to be more a secular person than a religious person, it didn't occur to me to do that. It was simply a mistake, a loss. But it does seem to me important now to try to think about forms of worship as staging practices that can carry over into real world life. And sometimes this is perfectly obvious about how it works, but sometimes it's not perfectly obvious. Let me give you an obvious case. In the literature about Satyapir, for example, there's a concentrated instruction about, often, in many of the texts, there's a concentrated instruction about how to treat sudden riches. And the answer is, you're not responsible. You didn't do this. You didn't earn this. You didn't get rich suddenly because of something you did. You did it because Satyapir arranged for it. And your obligation is not just to worship the true peer. The obligation is to share what you have with others. And of course, people do that in the real world by making the shirni, the little candy paste that's used in worship, and then by distributing that to their neighbors. So they act out in the worship the kind of generosity that the text teaches by showing us people who suddenly get forgetful and kind of selfish and forget to worship and are enjoying life, but not really thinking about their moral obligations to other people. And then, Peter takes it all away and disaster happens and their ship sinks in the ocean and, so on. So they have to learn the hard lesson, which is, oh, now I'm poor again. And it was because I didn't do the worship. That kind of simple story, though, is reinforced by the kind of worship, by what the gift of what shirni, how people use that sugar candy that is made for worship. So I think that probably would apply to much more complicated forms of puja, where all the elements of a kingdom gathered together are gathered together, and each person has his or her own special role in the puja to be performed depending on what his family is, her family is, what their caste is, and the whole puja becomes a kind of drama that reveals the hierarchical structure of the puja. It's very different if we look at a Dharma Gajan, where the emphasis is not on hierarchical structure at all. The forms of worship are reduced to only really 2 or maybe 3. And the most important worshipers are not the most important people in the village by any means. They're the lowly people in the village. And often, at least in the old ways, in the old days when Gajan was performed, the whole thing ends in a communal feast that includes the consumption of newly fermented rice wine. So that's just kind of turning a puja upside down, or leveling it out compared to the hierarchical way of doing Durga Puja, for example, in a kingdom. So I wish I had paid more attention to the relation between forms of worship and the instructions about social life that are found in Mongol Kabbo. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about history. I said that I thought I was writing about history, social history, without taking really very seriously what social history might be, how social history is different from cultural history, if it is different, what's the kind of knowledge that we're trying to get from social history. We could even be self-critical and ask, what's the kind of power that we're exercising as we form this kind of knowledge and try to instruct other people in it? All of those difficult questions about history I had not learned about as I was being educated. So I've come to them only in the course of trying to do history and then trying to think about what other people are doing, and then trying to think, how would this affect my way, how should this affect my way of doing history with literary texts? Here I would point you to my last article in the Indian Economic and Social History Review about a travelogue of a rich Bengali family who organized a trip to Benares, to Goya, to Benares, and then on to Prayag for a shraddha of the father of this, the grandfather of this family. I say this because it's the article that I think I became most clear about what a social history would look like, and it seems to me that and how it's related to a text, and I would say that what I think I found was that the virtues that are being taught, the skills, the agency that is being upheld in this text of a travelogue, which really is a text that praises the leading two brothers in this family, those virtues are both taught in the text and they're also displayed as the author writes the text. So what we're meant to learn here can be read as we try to understand who the author is and what he's trying to do, and it can be learned as we read about the people that the author's account is about in the author's account, and see what their virtues are, what their skills are. So there you get a kind of integration of the author's, how the author writes the text requires certain kinds of agencies and skills. For example, accounting. The author writes a day-by-day account of the journey from each stopping place to the next day's stopping place, and tells us something about those days. That's a way of keeping track, of keeping accounts. He also tells us really quite a good deal about what's spent in different places, and especially when we come to the shraddhas that are performed. We hear really quite a lot about the amount of money that it costs. He tells us really quite a lot about the art of conversation that introduces people to superior people who they want to know because they want to enter that circle of power and influence. And so we learn about that kind of agency, that kind of skill. How do you do that? How do you go meet a governor and talk to him and kind of win his heart, you know? What presents do you bring? All that kind of question gets talked about in the text, but the author at the same time is demonstrating how he has received exactly those gifts from his patrons, the people who went on the trip and took him along and told him to write the story. So what I'm trying to say is that's still a third way to enter into this. That's maybe the best way I found of entering into this question of social history. What are the skills of the author, and how do those skills match the kinds of things that he or she values in writing the piece of literature that has been written? I think I'm a little ahead of time, but I'm also running out of energy and thought. It may be my age here that is showing up. So perhaps I will stop and let you think of questions.
Thank you, Professor Curley. I have a query, Professor Curley. I don't know if you can be connected here. I was thinking in terms of bottom-up movement. Bottom-up. I was thinking in terms of bottom-up. In many of the texts, in many of the Bengali texts, even if we take Chandi Mangal for that matter, or maybe Mansa Mangal and Chaitanya Charitamrit, if we take those texts into account, I found that the worshipping of local deities, for example, Sitala, then Lakshmi, Saraswati, these goddesses are connected with Durga. Sure. Over a period of time, when these goddesses, got Sanskritized, Brahmanized, Hinduized, and then they got connected, then somehow found a niche in Durga. So that is how we have these deities as part and parcel of Durga performing different, at different functions. They have different manifestations altogether. So my question to you is, can we somehow relate the entire, the process with the people who are marginalized for quite some time and placed in a position where they could take decision, where they could have a kingdom for themselves and be worshipped or maybe considered to be a part of divinity. How would you say that? Because that is what I was thinking about after going through Annoda Mongol, Dharma Mongol, and Chaitanya Charitamrita. After going through all this, that is what I found. How would you relate to that, Professor Curley?
I'm not sure I quite understood your question.
See, the question is when you go for the manifestation of leading deities, female deities. Now, if we take into account Sitala, for that matter, Sitala has no existence prior to Mongol Kabbo. If you read, so how do you place Sitala or Chandi in terms of Mongol Kabu, because they are local deities. They are local deities over a period of time, got
Certainly true.
got inculcated into Durga, became a part of Durga, manifestation of Durga, different forms of Durga. So how would it be correct? Wouldn't it be correct to describe this entire movement as bottom up?
I'm missing the last word.
Bottom up.
Bottom up.
Bottom up.
Bottom up. Yes. No, I don't think so. Unfortunately, no, I don't. It's an intriguing idea, and I don't mean to say that you can't find out important things about the lower levels. I'm not sure the lowest levels, but lower levels in Hindu society from these texts. But on the whole, I think that we have to be cautious in thinking that because they show lowly deities in the pantheon, or because they have lowly humans in the human part of the action, that they are written in support of lowly humans in society. And I think that I don't mean to say that this cannot ever be possible, but I think we have to be cautious in making the assumption. I watched people make, and maybe it's different for goddesses than gods, but I watched people make the assumption Dharma Mongol are performed for the Gajong. Gajong really is not a hierarchical event, and therefore Dharma Mongol is about these, the domes and so on, who are the performers of the Gajong, but it's just not true. It does not support them in the end. It criticizes them in the end. It keeps them down. It doesn't hold them up. So I just think we have to be cautious about it. That's all I'd say. Shitala, I think, is a special and really interesting case, and I would urge. I'm just starting to read. What's his name? Chakrabarti, Nityananda Chakrabarti's Shitala Mongol, but so I'm not an expert on this at all. And he's certainly a Brahmin and concerned to be very fancy in the way he presents the text. There's a lot of Sanskrit put into this, or Sanskrit-derived things in it. And a lot of it is just obscure, at least to me. But Shitala is about injustice, I think. I borrow this from other people who've written about her, and there really might be a case where who is it who gets affected the most by smallpox and diseases? It's not going to be the rich people so much. And it's not a goddess specifically for these diseases, but maybe a goddess of the poor, especially if she is punishing people that fail to worship her. Not the kind of thing that a poor person would probably do.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Gurley.
In that case, I think you're on good ground in that particular case.
Yeah, I suppose so.
But I don't take my word for it. Go and look at the text, find out.
Yes, I have read Anada Mongol. I have read Maharashtra Puran.
Yeah.
So so since Bengali is my father's tongue, so I can read it very
Yeah, of course.
fluently. So,
Yeah.
so that is what in fact, it was there in my mind for quite some time to
Yeah.
relate with the marginalized community, to relate with those, who started, moving upwards.
Yeah.
So somehow that is what I found. In fact, that is what it in fact was, it intrigued me, Professor Kurt.
There are cases of this. I as I think about it, I think about ways that I would support you. For example, the woodcutter stories in Onondaga,
Yes,
the woodcutter story in Onondaga. That's a story of people who a person who comes up from nothing. So there you get, I think, this idea of sudden wealth, just unimaginable transformation of a person's status in life. And I think that probably does, it's not an accident that these are woodcutters, because Calcutta absorbed an enormous amount of wood. It just was a huge market for wood. And people were trying to make bricks, to build houses, and to pave the roads. If you were a woodcutter, you could have a good life, especially if you get the kind of people that would do the work for you. I think it really is about, that old order is just, anything can happen in it now.
yes, that's true. It seems we have received some questions from the students.
Please, yeah.
Can you, student Paramita, can you please explain how the agricultural crisis led to the downfall of the Mughal Empire?
How the agricultural crisis led to the downfall of the Mughal Empire. That's a really good question. Do you mean agricultural or agrarian?
I think she meant agrarian, if I'm not wrong.
And if it's agrarian, then this is a long-established position. It says the Mughal treasury was emptied because it overextended itself in territory as it tried to conquer the South. And it could never get back from the South the resources that it took to control the South, or it added too many people in the nobility and could never get resources to pay them their mansabs out of the treasury that they were owed. But in either case, the treasury was exhausted and they lost their fiscal power, monetary power, and so they lost their military power as well, because armies won on money. So that's roughly the story. I think it is more complicated because there are agricultural crises as well in the 17th and 18th century. We know a little bit more about them in the 17th century, and at least I'm a little bit less clear about when they happened in the 18th century, but certainly the early part of the 18th century is better off in terms of famines, and the later part of the 18th century is worse off, and the mid 16th century was just awful. So I think we could say something also about crises in agriculture, not just in the agrarian order, but in how much food could be produced in periods of cold weather droughts. So I would say to the student, it might be interesting to take an ecological approach to some of these texts and ask yourself, are they being written in times of famine? I think, for example, of Kamalamangal, where you get 100 varieties of rice being named in the text. that might be, that might be prosperity, but it might be famine that text really is about.
Another question. Dvija Madhava's Chandi Mangal mentions a demon Mongol Daitya, a great admirer of Shiva, which Mukunda's Chandi Mangal of the same time does not. So is this term somehow related to Mughals?
I'm sorry, I missed the first mention. The Doito is who?
Mongol Daitya.
Mongol Doito.
Mongol
Yeah.
Doito.
Okay.
Mongol Doito. So the Dvija Madhava's Chandi Mangal mentions Mongol Doito, a great admirer of Shiva.
Of Shiva.
Shiva.
It's
So which Mukunda's Chandi Mongol of
well, you know more about it than I do. I'm sorry, but I don't know. It's a very intriguing question, and I encourage you to explore it. How would you know? What would be the evidence? What would be a kind of marker in the text that you could take as, okay, I'm sure it's being used this way. So I would encourage you to ask, what is the role of this Doito in the text you're looking at? What does he do? And I'll give you an answer.
Also, she has asked how much Mongol Kabot tells us about Mughals and how important this Mughals and how important this Mongol Bengali vernacular literature differs from the court literature in understanding the Mughals.
And is she saying Mughals?
Mughals. In fact,
Mughal
she's
dynasty.
asked how. In fact, yes, Mughal as in great Mughals. So her question. So the Professor Curley, the question is, in fact, she has tried to sum up with that, how much Mongol Kabot tells about the Mughals.
Yes, a really good question. It's aside from maybe Bharachandra's Ananda Mongol, we don't get Mughals as characters that I know of. So it would be a kind of indirect language. It's not impossible that it is about Mughals, but using other words so as to not arouse criticism. So you can say things in a veiled way that you can't say things just right on in public. You know what I'm saying? So if I want to talk about a certain president of mine and I was worried about him retaliating, I might not use his name, but use characteristics that everybody would know. Is this strange way of combing his hair, for example. Right? And I don't have to name him for you to know who I mean. Well, I think in the same way, they're all characters that are not named as necessarily, but may tell us something about what the author thought about Mughal rule. I'd be a little bit cautious about trying to do this, but I think that's a kind of approach I would take.
And her next question is how important this Bengali vernacular literature is, and can we differ from the court literature in understanding the Mughals?
From the courtly literature, I think it really is different. I think Dharma Mongol is an example of this. I think that's an attempt to create a military culture in Bengal, and it operates at a lower level of society than the fancy zemindars with their connections to the Nawabs and maybe to other local Mughal nobility, but it would give us a different picture, especially if we could take Quraysh as a kind of substitute figure for the Nawab. I think, however, that on the whole, Mangu Kabo are about localities, and the localities are somewhat far away from the Mughal court, so they don't tell us much about it.
Any questions? Any more questions? Another question. Sir, you made a distinction between subjective and objective history. As far as our approach to history is concerned, do we keep them separate or do
No.
we link them?
No, you can't. You can't do it. No, I didn't mean to suggest that. And I've never been happy writing one without the other. But it's important to be clear about what whether you're trying to describe the world as the world, or whether you're trying to describe not necessarily the world, but what people are thinking. But no, it's not the kind of distinction that can be maintained. It collapses as soon as you look at it very hard. Is it me who's making all this?
Any more questions? Any further? All right. Oh,
I think Aditi, yeah, Aditi,
I can sum up now.
yeah, you can please.
Yeah. I thank you, Professor Curley, for taking out your valuable time to deliver this informative and a highly interactive lecture. And I'm sure students were benefited from your words. I also thank our principal, Professor Moria, for her inspiration and my fellow faculty members for supporting. I also proffer my heartfelt gratitude to the convener Dharohar, Dr. Garima Prakash, for giving me this opportunity for organizing and inviting you on this platform. And last but not the least, my heartfelt gratitude to my students whose constant interest in academics motivated me to organize this webinar. And sir, we hope to have many more webinars with you, and I trust you will graciously consent for this. Thank you and good night.
Thank you all for inviting me, and thank you students especially for being here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, sir.
Good night.